It's not like adolescents aren't confused about sex and their identity. That's what adolescence is confusion about sex and identity. And generally
Pure
what
confusion
happens.
about everything. What do I do? Who am I?
Yeah, exactly. And no wonder, right? Because you have a lot of choices ahead of you. And
Right.
and it's a tumultuous time. There's a lot of neurological reorganization.
Mm-hmm.
And so
it's too many choices.
well, look, there's a huge literature on consumer choice. So let's say you might ask yourself, how many shampoos do you want to go look at when you're shopping? 1, 5, or 300?
5.
5, exactly. Why not 300? Because one of those 300 is the best.
Diminishing returns on my investment of
That's
time.
for sure. And how are you going to evaluate 300 items for quality? You're just, no matter which one you pick, you've made a mistake. When you go into Subway and they say, how do you want your sandwich? Like, I want you to figure that out. That's why I'm paying for it. If I have to make every sandwich decision, I might as well make it. So people drown in choice very rapidly.
Right. Talk about anxiety, right?
Yes, exactly. Well, that is anxiety. It's terrible anxiety. And too many choices is anxiety. So, and it isn't like it's not like I know the answer to how much choice about your gender you should have. But I think that, we need to recognize that there's wide variation in personality within women and within men, even though there are differences. And mostly men and women overlap, by the way. So we're more the same than we are different, except at the extremes, and that matters. Mm-hmm. Like if you're low in agreeableness enough, 1 in 100, let's say, you're way more likely to be in prison. And so that's males. Mm-hmm. So there are not very many women in prison compared to men. And that's because at the extremes, there's a huge preponderance of aggressive men. I mean, it's been interesting to see what's happened with sex over the course of my lifetime. I mean, in the 60s, there was this idea, and it was probably the consequence of the birth control pill, that, well, maybe sex is free, right? It's free and easy because, well, now pregnancy wasn't necessarily a consequence, and venereal disease was reasonably well under control, and so wasn't a blatant threat, certainly not a fatal one. And so people thought, well, why not free love? Well, I think the reason for that is it's complete rubbish. There's no free sex. It's too dangerous. And so what's happened is that...
From an emotional standpoint? Are you speaking about from an emotional standpoint or physically?
Physically and socially. Well, think of consent. Okay, when can you give consent? Well,
you're saying
the
what
answer
age?
is we don't know. No,
or
under
like
what conditions?
Well,
what constitutes consent? Exactly. A whim?
Yes.
What if you change your mind? What if you're intoxicated? What if you're stoned? What if you're upset? What if you feel you've been manipulated? Because the issue of consent is not, if the act is serious, and you can debate about whether or not that is, and people have their differences of opinion, it's certainly emotionally significant in all likelihood. So if it's significant, well, then consent is important. Well, what constitutes consent? Well, marriage does. So that's where sex was encapsulated fundamentally, because the consent was never an issue. I mean, there's all sorts of things that weren't an issue because of that. And it wasn't like it was a magical solution to everything. But so, because in the 60s, the idea was that sex could be casual. Well, AIDS pretty much put the end to that idea, at least in part, right? So, and it definitely spread as a consequence of promiscuity. That was definitely one of the driving factors that put AIDS everywhere. So that was not so good, to put it mildly. And then the reaction on campuses is, well, what constitutes consent? And the reason that has become questionable is because it's questionable. Unless it's not serious. But, I don't think that people really believe that. So they might wish they believed it. But there's plenty of emotional damage done as a consequence of too quick intimacy. I think that's generally the case because in a partnership that becomes intimate, there's usually one person who's more emotionally invested than the other.
Probably
Almost inevitably, yes.
I mean, I think inevitably in every situation.
Well, pretty much, yeah, pretty
They
much.
can still be very high, but someone's still going to be more than the other. So this kind of leads to the conversation about individuality being the way out of ideological traps. And the question is how and what are the ways to know who you are? Because I don't think it's as easy as it sounds. Like, who are you?
It's impossible. People are really complicated. Yeah. You're way more complicated than anything else except another person, right? You're the most complicated thing that exists.
Then put two complicated people together and...
Yeah, well, hopefully they can help each other sort themselves out, at least to some degree. But yeah, I mean, to be self-aware completely is just not possible because, what we try to do to understand ourselves is limit what we'll do. And you do that to other people too. Say, well, I know you. And then you punish them if they do things you don't understand. That way they stay in the box you put them in. And there's downside to that and an upside. It's part of the social contract not to do outrageous things, although you could. So we all abide by these rules, and that simplifies us a lot. Right. That's part of being polite is you don't want the bank teller to be complex. You want them to be polite and simple. So your limited understanding is sufficient. And we do that with each other all the time, except when we're emotional.
How do you find the individuality, your uniqueness, your specialness?
Well, that probably manifests itself to a large degree in what you're interested in.
Which is difficult to know. I think that's also difficult to know. I felt like it took into my mid-30s before I'm like, oh yeah, I'm really interested in these things.